Good evening, everyone. Hello, hello. Thank you all for being here tonight for the Business Value of Sustainability as we kick off the Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit here in Singapore. Before we get into our dinner content, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our summit advisor, Schneider Electric, for making tonight's dinner possible. And a quick note to all of you here in the audience, please enjoy your meals as we're having our discussions on stage. We are very excited to have you as we kick off this important night. With that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, David Stringer, for a conversation with Harry Cho, Managing Director and Head of Sustainability and Sustainable Finance at SGX Group.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening for this event and for this conversation. And thanks for the introduction, Abby. As my colleague said, joining us is Harry Cho, Managing Director, Head of Sustainability and Sustainable Finance for SGX Group. We have about 20 minutes for the conversation and a couple of areas that we want to cover. We'll start with transition finance. It's an area that's been challenged often by a lack of one single specific definition. So tell me, what does transition finance mean for you and for SGX Group, and how has that lack of a clear definition presented challenges?
Thanks, David. So I understand that we've got some virtual audience from around the world as well joining. So for those who are not familiar with SGX Group, we are the Singapore Exchange Group, and we're a multi-asset exchange, not only with equities, but derivatives, fixed income, a JV with carbon markets, FX, among other instruments. Now, transition finance, very topical. And one thing we can say is that Asia embraced the need for transition quite early, as many of the experts in the room here would know. And the need to have some level of common definition and understanding what transition finance is transpired quite early on. I remember when we were starting to work on actually Singapore Asia taxonomy in 2019. There were quite a bit of discussion on how to tackle that, because at that time the EU taxonomy actually did not include transition, right? So a lot of thought went in, and very thoughtful inputs to define what that means. And what we see today, and of course taxonomies is not the only proliferation of definition, and that's one of the challenges we see. But if you look at the definition of the taxonomy for Singapore, not only Singapore, but also other parts of Asia, you're starting to see what it means to have, for example, amber category, which is that transition definition. So, for example, in steel sector, we all know, new tech that's yet to be fully commercialized, like electric arc furnace, will be green, but there are further definitions on what makes an EAF green, but also amber, and there's a sunset date as well, like 2030, before it can actually no longer be a transition asset.
Great. You mentioned steel, among the sort of hardest to abate sectors. What can exchanges do? What role do exchanges have, among others, to encourage that flow of finance to hard to abate sectors? That's really the sort of key challenge. What's the role of an exchange like SGX?
So, an exchange is an interesting place to be, because in many ways you're at the heart of the ecosystem where so many players come together. Now, one of the roles that we defined early on is we have to support the mobilization of capital when it comes to transition finance. And a unique challenge that exchanges have to look at is a key conundrum that transition finance actually faces, which is that we have to understand the definition of transition at the securities level, so the issuer level, rather than project by project level, right? And one of the key buckets that we see that where the financing really needs to take this into account as well is index-based investing and index-based risk mitigation tools as well. So, we put up our hand to be a co-chair of, and in fact, played a key role in devising what needs to be done by the industry overall for a global work stream called Transition to Net Zero Index Investing under GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is also supported by Bloomberg, amongst many other financial institutions as well. And many different actors came together, asset owners, asset managers, index providers, exchanges, to actually come up with a guidance that leverages upon some work that asset owners did and asset managers did already. And so some sort of framework and guidance for best practices is going to come out for public consultation in October at PRI in person in Toronto. But taking that to a practical level as well, just going back to that issuer level definition and going back to the example of steel, David, what's extremely important and coming out from what asset owners and like pension funds, etc., are saying is we can not only invest in green because that is like 5% of the overall economy. Yeah. And so how do you actually not exclude the sectors that's hard to abate? And therefore, we've been working with industry partners to define indices where you can actually put AUM behind or use those hedging tools as well, where actually you're not excluding, you're not making it a low carbon index, but you are actually giving more weight to players within a sector. So there's no sectoral exclusion, there's no geographic exclusion, but there is actually preferential weighting or actually cutting off of the lower 50% and only including the top 50% within a sector, right? For those who are actually meeting some of the criteria, whether that be they have science-based targets in place, green revenues in place, that the management has readiness on actually implementing some of this, and of course that's after certain exclusions. So we're trying to resolve, although nothing is perfect at that issuer level, how do you actually continue to fund that transition?
Do you see tools like that, mechanisms that can offer assurances, do you see that having an impact in terms of persuading investors who may remain reluctant to put money to work in heavy emitting industries?
Yeah.
Do you see that having an impact and encouraging people to maybe rethink some of the restrictions they may have placed on investments previously?
Well, I suppose, David, the question is what came first, right? So there are many investors, whether it's global or more emerging markets focused investors, who have been saying, or they're looking for a path as to how to implement it. We all know that Paris Agreement is trying to aim towards 2050, right, on average. But it also does say in Paris Agreement that there are common but differentiated responsibilities by sovereign actors. But often when it comes to companies or corporate actors, it's on a global basis, often is treated the same. So how do you actually practically embed that in a credible way? And so in some of the ways that investors have been doing it is they do have differentiated approach between emerging markets and developed markets. Some global investors even say that certain hard-to-abate sectors, companies in the development markets, there's no excuse if they only have commitment but are not showing action against the commitment, achieving those commitments. Whereas in emerging markets, they may be a bit more lenient on the timeline on what needs to be achieved, as well as taking into context the nationally determined contributions or the sovereign level as well. So I think we are some of this technical work that is ongoing and sort of new suite of transition to net zero products that we're seeing are actually in response to demand by investors. But if I just may add one more, the regulatory field is not making it any easier. Some of you may have seen just last week on 24th of July, ESMA, the European Securities and Market Authority, gave an opinion on their views on sort of long-term development of sustainable finance in the EU, and they did opine that they believe that SFDR should be phased out over time and replaced by EU taxonomy as a common definition, right? And so whilst that was regulatory driven, you know, the land beneath our feet, it's almost like we are sort of doing the mechanics as we drive at the same time, right? That's the reality of the field that we're all working in, but it's an important work.
That sort of brings us to regulation, to disclosure. You know, here in Singapore, the regulatory arm of the exchange is talking to the market about how to incorporate ISSB standards. What impact do you foresee that could have, you know, both positive, you know, and in terms of adding an additional burden of compliance for those listed here?
Sure. So not to say that we should not take action until data is perfect, but data it's unfortunately true. Without good data, good comparable data, we're not going to be able to measure, you know, practically the transition that we need to undergo. And so with that in mind, we were really quite heartened to see that there was an international acceptance, and certainly from securities markets and exchanges perspective, IOSCO has been involved right from the beginning on endorsing ISSB and giving inputs from the beginning, including MAS from Singapore as well. And so ISSB, or International Sustainability Standards Board, is a set of level setting on sustainability disclosure, which Singapore has also, from regulatory perspective, have announced to adopt. It would be undertaken for two set groups. So, of course, the listed companies, and I see a number of listed company experts in the room here as well. We've already been a market that had a mandatory sustainability reporting regime since 2016, and it was further fortified to include TCFD since 2022. From financial year 2025's reporting, it's going to be mandatory to do climate-related disclosure based upon ISSB 2. In Singapore, it's not only going to be for listed companies. The private companies that's incorporated here above certain size, for example, more than $1 billion in revenue, will also have to do it, but under slightly later timeline for financial year reporting starting 2027.
And just briefly, you know, is there a risk in markets that may have a differentiated approach, or, you know, for Singapore to be, you know, an earlier adopter of these standards? You know, this is a market where we've seen company listings decline over time. You know, is the prospect of more onerous compliance, more onerous regulation, is that a risk to, you know, to any ambition to see that rate of company listings increase?
Yeah. So, you know, the other thing that I find as an exchange is that for every action that an exchange takes, everything has to be taken in balance. And so when this, you know, regulation was being launched as well, of course, there were open consults. I hope many of you had responded to that as well, which is now closed, and you know, we're now undertaking the work to put it into listing rules. Yeah, it is a consideration. You know, how do you make sure that you do not create overly onerous requirements so that companies might be deterred from coming to a market that's transparent and helping investors understand some of the emerging opportunities and risks that sectors and companies face, right? So that's certainly been taken into account, and what's coming out and the rules that's been coming out is something that takes that into account as well. But having said that, there has been, broadly speaking, support in the market. Even for the TCFD disclosure and had that going into regulations, there has been significant support by the majority of the market for the implementation.
That's great. If I can take you to sort of products and opportunities, in terms of sort of new offerings, new product offerings, where is XGX seeing, I guess, the strongest growth? And where do you see the best opportunities from here to whether that's adding new products, extending some of the offerings that you currently have?
Yeah. Okay, so I think one topic that's always been very popular for at least last 4 years is carbon markets, right? Which has also gone through quite choppy, volatile market that's been actually quite unprecedented if you're a market player, solely looking at carbon markets. One thing that we would say about carbon markets is whilst there's been sort of two ends of the spectrum as to whether carbon credits and carbon markets are credible, and on the other side saying they are very important. On balance, how we see it is that carbon credits done the right way is an instrument that can belong in a decarbonization toolkit to make sure that funding really actually goes to projects where it needs to go, especially in emerging markets, right? And so that's why, yes, markets will never be linear, and making sure that this is the crux of greenwashing, right? Ensuring that any instruments, including carbon credits, does what it says on the tin, right? So that's some of the work that's been ongoing, and Climate Impact X, which is one of our JV companies, have been playing a role in ensuring that the credibility in the credits that they offer are there as well. But so long as some of these important boxes are ticked, we should continue to develop how that instruments can play a role. But more broadly speaking, David, I think, just when it comes to emerging markets, that transition that need to undergo and taking into consideration the socioeconomic balance, how does that translate in concrete terms into instruments that actually pull in capital, right? And so just one example where we have been doing deep work with is an example with MSCI, where an index was devised to look at, specifically, what it actually means to have a company to be undergoing good transition, right? And working through how can the methodology be as transparent as possible. So making sure there's key transparency in some of these instruments is also another important point.
Fantastic. Just briefly, as I'm conscious of time, in terms of other opportunities, very broadly, derivatives, obviously a huge opportunity for all manner of exchanges, not only in sustainable finance, but when it comes to sustainable finance, what are the opportunities there? Weather derivatives have been, incredibly popular, had a bit of a moment in the spotlight in recent months. Is that an opportunity for Singapore? And briefly, sort of, what are potentially some of the other new product areas you could explore?
Yeah. So, it does happen to be that we are a big derivatives market, both for equities and commodities as well, cash-settled derivatives in commodities. So when it comes to equity, I don't know whether some of you have been following, but there's been some very interesting discussions, including weigh-ins from certain regulators as well, as to how derivatives, whether it's long or short, should be accounted for when it comes to accounting for GHG footprint. So should you, when you look at a total position, should it be a net position? Should you be adding in the long position? Should you be netting off the short position, So that kind of thing from GHG perspective, it's a very live conversation. But, when we come to the practical just usage, right? derivatives are just in use because there's many different roles that derivatives can play, whether that's cash equitization for, cash that the treasury team has, or you want a certain exposure, at a more, with a smaller quantum, right? Directional exposure. So you can still utilize the way that derivatives get used and layer on the climate component to make that happen as well. On the commodities front, there are many players, like, for example, in the electric vehicle value chain, who have, for example, need to procure lithium, or cobalt, because those are key components of batteries. And sometimes they don't have, the market has been super volatile, at times increasing by 3 times, right, in a space of 1 year. So we've been launching some hedging tools to help mitigate the pricing risk of some of these key commodities.
Fantastic. We're just about out of time. And so if you could join me in just saying thank you to Harry Cho. Really interesting conversation. And you'll hear next from my colleague Lauren Keel with our next conversation. So please join me in thanking Harry.
Thanks, Tim.
Let's hear it for the people who take ambition and turn it into action. The individuals, the organizations who impact our daily lives, bridging progress and sustainability for all. Through automation, electrification, and digitization. Let's hear it for the impact makers.
Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be with you. I'm happy to be here on stage today with Pang-Xing Zhan, who's the Zone President of East Asia for Schneider Electric. Pang, can you tell me, how has sustainability become a business imperative for Schneider Electric?
Thank you, Laura. First, please allow me to give a sincere thanks to Bloomberg to really have Schneider Electric to be the summit of advisor. This give a lot of chance for Schneider Electric to see how we look at sustainability. I think most of the companies are really looking for different mega changes around of us. So, for example, we see the climate change a lot. Probably most of the people in Singapore couldn't feel so much about it. But actually, in the rest of the world, people feel this drastically impact their life, and also many companies really think climate change become very, very impacting on their business. So this is the first mega trend we are facing. The second one is about energy transition. We used to get used about all this fossil energy, but now because of the sustainability target that many people think, oh, let's use renewable energy. But also many companies think, this is a big opportunity. Probably if everything's fine until 2030, it's a big market, like $3 trillion per year. Nevertheless, many companies think it's still very vulnerable that renewable energy to be used everywhere, and you don't know how to really make it happen. The third mega change is about digitalization. On one side, we think we can use digital to really benefit our energy efficiency. But also we feel that a strong energy demand needed for this digitalization. For example, when we talk about the AI, data centers in recent years, it needs huge demand of the energy. So this also brings us a lot of impact. The last but not least, we are talking about new global equilibrium that many people think about with this geopolitical reasons that how to reshore of the global supply chain by different continents, which is currently the situation. So this is what we start.
And how are companies in APAC feeling the impact of these global trends?
Yeah, I think in this region, especially in East Asia, that many people think, with this climate change, probably around one third of the companies feel the financial or physical risk caused by this climate change. And also around 41% of the company really think about logistical costs increasing in recent years, in recent months because of the climate change. Meanwhile, regarding this energy transition, that probably 50% around of the companies really think how to utilize this energy transition or energy efficiency to help them to build more resilience amongst the supply chain. And actually, tomorrow, my colleague Farouk shared will talk about global supply chain. So we believe that with all this reshoring of the global supply chain, it will bring a lot of impact to the business of East Asia companies.
And what do you think leading companies are doing differently that's driving sustainable transformation?
Yeah, I think leading companies always think that how to utilize most of the technology innovation ecosystem to really build all the things in their business. And we call this impact maker. Schneider Electric is one of these impact maker, really drive all this sustainability into our business, into our ecosystems. We also can give some example here in Singapore, for example, like Ascot, one of the new greenfield project of Ascot Hotel, that they use our energy efficiency solutions to drive their operations by 10 to 20% of the savings per year. And also another pharmaceutical company named Takeda, also with their very brilliant industry in pharmaceutical, utilize Schneider solutions to also drive about 15% of the energy supplies every year. As Schneider Electric ourselves, we also have our current building in Kallang, headquarters of East Asia, which is a very old building. But with all the retrofit by technology of Schneider Electric, with 5,000 sensors deployed, and also make this building to be BDAs, the green mark buildings, to be the carbon neutral, carbon zero buildings, with a highly recognition by Singapore.
Thank you so much for joining me with these insights, and thank you to Schneider Electric.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thank you. Yeah.
All right. Michelle, thank you so much for joining me tonight. We're going to be talking about decarbonizing your supply chain, which I think is a challenge for everyone working in this space. As we're talking about the business value of sustainability, obviously, the returns your company's making is a big part of that, but there's also trying to hit that cost savings element, finding efficiencies. You have a really unique role at SingPost where procurement sits under your purview. Can you tell us a little bit about that intersection of Chief Sustainability Officer and procurement?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, and I think it amazes some people when I tell them that story that, on top of the sustainability work that I do, I've got procurement in my portfolio as well, and that raised several eyebrows. Yeah. And I thought that was actually quite a strategic move because procurement has got a lot to do with influencing not just Scope 3, right? It actually influences on scope 1, 2, and 3, all the three dirty numbers, right? It's got and that design, of that combination is interestingly allowing me, right, to change the way the company procures by putting the consideration of carbon right at the beginning, right, where it influences not only how you use, but what are you buying, right? That will actually influence the use of it eventually, and what comes out from your operations, right? Which is what all the carbon emissions is all about.
Right.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. I would love to hear a little bit more about your suppliers, who you're working with. Talk about a tangled web you weave within, a company like SingPost. It's, Postal Service Logistics. You're working with big and small suppliers. Can you tell us a little bit about the difference between the two that you observe when it comes to decarbonization efforts?
Yeah, indeed. So with the process of mapping our Scope 3 inventory right now as we're developing it, that actually allows you to gain better insights into your supply chain. So very much to what Harry is talking about, right? It's all in the data. And, having collected data painfully in the last couple of years, so, and we're able to gain certain insights, very much guided by GHG protocol on the Scope 3 accounting, and you're able to understand where the material contributors lie. And from there, you are then able to prioritize where are you able to focus to make the biggest impact in reduction. And that's exactly what we have done. And suppliers need to be on board. Now, if you have anyone who has calculated Scope 3, right, it doesn't surprise me. It's about 80% of your carbon footprint, right? At least 70. And with that number, obviously, your supply chain plays a big part. Now, with supply chain, you can't control directly what they do, whether they even give you the data, correct data. And data accuracy, well, it's great to have that later on in terms of the Scope 3. There needs to be a transition to help the suppliers who have not actually come on board data collection process, right? And what we have done is we have got a plan to be engaging with the suppliers and help them ease into it. Businesses have got a lot of pressures nowadays. They've got to look at the bottom line. They have got regulatory requirements. They've got inflationary pressures, labor issues, lots to consider. So with that in a balance of sustainability, you need to help them on their journey, right? And say, for example, in terms of SingPost, we have got the supplier code of conduct to at least first communicate what exactly are our expectations, right? But doesn't mean that you can't get onto that and we'll drop you. No, that's not the right approach, right? Instead, we will take them on the journey with us, right? And we help them understand, okay, so perhaps these are some of the tools that you can be using, right? And for certain countries, the governments are very proactive in offering assistance. And Singapore is one of those, right? Whether it's Enterprise Singapore or whether it's Singapore Business Federation, they are all offering assistance to small and medium enterprises especially, right, to get on that journey. And when we are engaging with our supply chain, with their cost pressures that they are facing, we do differentiate who are the bigger boys, right, and who are the ones who will probably need assistance. So that differentiation is probably quite important to take note of, right, and to engage accordingly as well.
You mentioned the sort of government stepping in to assist some of these SMEs on this. I'm curious, in your experience engaging with that, smaller level of supplier, is that, inflation pressure and the cost burden of this the main barrier to them being brought on board, or are there other challenges that are sort of preventing them from, immediately coming on board and, needing a little bit more time?
I think cost is just one of the components, right? A lot of the small and medium enterprises actually don't understand the urgency of them embarking on this journey as yet. I recall there was an article by Business Times, I think shortly after ACRA, put its recommendation forward, requiring non-listed companies to be reporting on climate-related disclosures. A lot of small and medium enterprise actually didn't think there was a need for them to be embarking on, sooner. And my advice is actually, the contrary. You should get onto the journey right now. Right? It takes a while, and a lot of them don't know how to as well. So that's probably the bigger challenge that they are facing, and they don't know that the bigger boys are actually changing the way they procure, right? Because a lot of companies now are facing their net zero pressures.
Yeah.
A lot of companies has already put through their net zero targets, and they cannot not do anything, right?
Right.
So with that, procurement is going to be one of the large aspects of it. And like I mentioned earlier, it's not just the Scope 3 that is coming on board. It's also in terms of influencing and impacting the Scope 1 and 2. So obviously, smaller companies will need to get on it, and help is required.
Yeah, absolutely. Harry and David mentioned the word onerous quite a bit during their session, when it comes to the mandatory standards and the different, disclosure pieces that companies are facing today. Do you find these things onerous at this point, or are you sort of working through, the shift from the mandatory standards to voluntary reporting?
Yeah, so we've gone through a journey ourselves, right? So since SGX Redco has required listed companies to start reporting on sustainability, we have since started on that, and many companies have jumped on board that, but we would have missed the opportunity if we are only focusing on it from a compliance reporting basis, right? We actually see a lot of value in what that reporting brings to the business and the benefits that it brings. Let me give you an example. Scope 1 and 2, by having the visibility, collecting the data and reporting it, you know where your footprint, what the sources of the carbon emissions are coming from. And from there, you are able to, in a very organized and disciplined manner, look at the data, analyze it, and be very focused and targeted in your reduction initiatives. And with data, you're able to understand where the material areas are and make very meaningful reductions. And that's exactly what we have done. So having benefited from understanding, yes, it might be onerous, right? There's a lot of engagement internally, but as long as you're able to prove the business case, right? And that's how we have done it with our internal stakeholders, to help them understand what this data is going to do and help us. And we are actually showing in terms of financial savings on the bottom line. Now, on the flip side, there's a lot of customers and investors who are also asking for this data.
Sure.
There's an opportunity for businesses to commercialize that data that you have, right? It can be very valuable from that sense as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting. You mentioned kind of engaging with your executive leadership team, making sure that they're bought in. I think it sounds like the structure of the company and your sort of role speaks to that a little bit more. And you also mentioned earlier just sort of that the challenge today is that business leaders are facing so many different priorities coming at them. Can you give us an example of a time that you faced, some business changes or shifts that maybe didn't put into question your sustainability goals, but sort of intersected up against that, and how you sort of worked through another business priority while being able to maintain, your sustainability prowess?
Yeah, so one very scenario that plays to that very well is our recent acquisition into a business in Australia, and we have now become one of the top players in logistics in that market. And one way to look at it is, oh my goodness, you've bought a really big organization, and in transportation, that's going to add up, in your carbon emissions, right? Well, I look at it from a glass half full, where it is an opportunity for us to decarbonize another company and helping the industry decarbonize itself. And that's what we'll need to do as well when we are looking at investments, whether it's into your infrastructure or into new businesses. We must consider sustainability as part of the consideration. It is not one of the things by the side that you should be considering, right? It needs to be part of it. It's just like how you procure. A certain percentage of that consideration must be there because you have set yourself targets. And by achieving those targets, you are also enjoying the benefits of cost savings. And in a way, you are also increasing your probability of generating better income, better revenue, right? Because you're able to capture a better market.
Yeah. I think that's really, a good point on sort of just those business challenges that people are facing and how it has to be at the forefront of this. Otherwise, it's going to get lost. I love your perspective on glass half full and just, this isn't scary if you see a company that your company is trying to acquire that has, maybe metrics that you wouldn't like them to have, but it is an opportunity to have that sort of influence more broadly. I am curious just, if you could give us a piece of advice for proving the business value of sustainability. I think we probably have a lot of people in this room tonight who are coming from sustainability teams, the people who are out in the weeds doing this work with varying levels of buy-in from their internal stakeholders. So can you tell us how you approach that internally? I know that, you mentioned it a little bit before, but what would you tell those people in our audience on how they can get buy-in from their stakeholders?
Right. Be very patient, over-communicate, and demonstrate in financial terms, right? We have actually also adopted internal carbon pricing. So when you have that mechanism, you help the business leaders understand sustainability and carbon from the viewpoint of the dollar sign. And when you actually do that, and if you can still be really profitable in the decarbonization journey, I think you've proven your point.
Yeah.
Right. So, and in terms of over-communicating, you just need to help people understand on an ongoing basis. Now, sustainability is an ever-evolving subject. And there's always new ways and case studies that present itself that demonstrates the value and the benefits to the business, right? And of course, it can't always be coming from external sources. Internally, prove your point, right, with real numbers in terms of cost savings and potentially also revenue of how with sustainability, how you are able to capture additional market share, right? So we have recently had one of these circumstances, and it was a great opportunity for me not to mention it. I just have to grab that opportunity and actually help people realize, look, it's because you have invested your efforts, right? And now it's actually showing the fruits of your labor. So I think, you do need to have a lot of these proof points, right? And communicate the proof points because if it's not, communicated, it's an opportunity lost in converting another person.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Speak in dollar signs and over-communicate are our takeaways for everyone. You had mentioned, scopes 1 and 2. We of course, our session is focusing on supply chain and scope 3 because it is, to your earlier point, such a big piece of people's emissions puzzle and often the most challenging to solve with these, data integrity issues. But I'm just curious, as someone who's working in this field, when you're looking at sort of the outlook for how the standards are impacting scopes 1 and scopes 2. Are we still in that phase? When do you think we'll actually reach meaningful impact when it comes to scope 3 as a result of some of the disclosures and standard setting that we're seeing now?
Yeah, so I think with the recent developments of S1 and S2 reporting requirements, that will hasten things up a little bit, right? And with the bigger companies who are obligated with the reporting requirements, they will have an influence on their supply chain, right? And they will obviously have to start, the supply chain will start with the scope 1 and 2, but eventually there's no escaping from scope 3. Yeah. So slowly but surely, as companies are transitioning, and scope 3 isn't very straightforward to account for, and a lot of people are using the spend base, right? But I think as more and more people are commercializing the sustainability, you will get to better improvement in data collection. And for example, after you have actually advanced very well into scope 1 and 2, then the next step for people is to allow their customers to have visibility on data, embark on life cycle assessment, for example, to give them a better visibility of the carbon from the product and the services that they're procuring. So that will actually help the ecosystem.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you had mentioned earlier, sort of the various stakeholders who can influence a company's decision to focus on sustainability, whether it's investors or different external pressures. You just mentioned customers. Is that something that you're hearing quite a bit at SingPost? Are your customers interested in hearing how you're progressing on these goals?
Increasingly. I'm having a lot more calls with customers now. And they are actually trying to understand, okay, so do you have a net zero target? What are you doing to reduce, and how are you able to give us better visibility of our carbon? Are you responding to CDP? Are you doing this? Are you doing so? They are very well informed now, right? And companies cannot ignore that anymore, right? It's got to be part of the formula in trying to generate your revenues moving forward. And to look at your bottom line, obviously, by looking at that, that's going to help you manage your operating cost as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think you've proved the business value of sustainability to me tonight just through our conversation. So, Michelle, thank you so much for joining me. We really appreciate you being here. And thanks to all of you for being such a wonderful audience. I would also love to thank our summit advisor, Schneider Electric, for making tonight's dinner possible. We are live tomorrow on our main stage just downstairs in the Grand Ballroom for the start of the Bloomberg Sustainable Business Summit. But in the meantime, please enjoy your food, enjoy your dessert, mingle, and have a great evening. Thank you very much.